Welcome, everyone. So my name is Danny Traum, and I have the great privilege of being the facilitator and consultant here at Melbourne Business School in the Executive Ed Department. I'd really like to welcome all of you. I'd like to welcome our staff, our students, our alumni and guests to our lunchtime masterclass. Today's session is really exciting. It's around leadership for new leaders and differentiating leadership. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I'm on today, and pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, elders, past, present, and emerging, to their communities who've shared and practiced their teaching over thousands of years. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's ongoing leadership and contribution to business, education, industry, and society. Melbourne Business School's vision is unleashing leaders for a sustainable future, and we do this by creating new knowledge to help understand, guide, and shape the future of business, government, and for the purpose sector, as well as shape the next generation of leaders. Events like today's masterclass offer ongoing learning and access to contemporary thinking in business and leadership, and is one of the many ways of supporting the school's commitment to lifelong learning. If you have any questions along the way throughout the session, you'll see at the bottom there's a little Q&A box, and we'll leave time at the end of the session to cover these. That said, at any point during this session, we will be quite interactive, and I will be throwing questions in as we go through. So I'd like to introduce you to our presenter today, Keegan Looters. So Keegan is a very experienced presenter, facilitator, coach, and in fact an author of 2 books on deliberate approaches to team performance. He's a key facilitator on this new leader development program and leadership for new leaders at the Melbourne Business School. For nearly 2 decades across Australia and New Zealand, he's been spanning small business, government, not-for-profit, education and large corporates. And he brings a really deep understanding of leadership, teams and performance into the program. He loves to work with he loves his work and has any opportunity to mention that he has a master's degree in business coaching from the Sydney Business School at the University of Wollongong. What that means is he asks a lot of questions and he tries to stay really curious. So today he's going to encourage us to consider a few questions to help us better lead in 26 and share some great insights and stories that will help you consider your next best steps. So the best way to get the most out of this is get curious, reflective, and maybe even a little interactive. So over to you, Keegan.
Thank you so much, Danny, for the warm welcome. And like to acknowledge I'm on Durrell land, which is in Wollongong, just south of Sydney, up here, and acknowledge the elders past, present, emerging from this land. And every time I do an acknowledgement of country, I remember a lot of my thinking and learning about Indigenous knowledge in Australia has come from a book by Tyson Yunkaporta Porter called Sand Talk. And in that, he talks about this idea that quite often we look at Indigenous culture through a Western lens and what might happen if we look at a Western culture through an Indigenous lens. And today, my goal is to help each of us on this conversation to sort of take a new lens at leadership. And so if you're in a relatively new position of leadership, one of the best things you can do is how you look at leadership can then impact the way that the actions that you take and the role that you see that you play and how you support the teams and the organization's goals. And so hopefully today we'll be able to help you differentiating leadership in a few different ways. But as Danny said, I'd also love it to be an interactive conversation as much as we can. We've got hundreds of people online, so we won't be able to speak to everyone all at once. But love you to just drop into the chat where you're joining this call from. Let us know where you're joining from. One of the great things about the programs here at Melbourne Business Schools is we do get people from a really broad and wide range of places. Quite often they are overseas. So we have people from Saudi Arabia, from Vanuatu, from New Caledonia. We have, Ballarat, Hobart, Stawell, Essendon Fields, very specific, Sunshine Coast, sunny Adelaide, Perth, sometimes we get a lot of people from New Zealand as well, but maybe not today. So Hobart, Latrobe, Horsham, Wurundjeri Country, Vegas.
There's something going on in Ballarat, Keegan. There's a lot of people from Ballarat.
Wonderful. Well, fantastic. Lovely to see. Looks like we're mainly Australian-based today, and happy. That's fantastic, and love for you to keep using that I'd love for you to keep using the chat as much as we can. I'll interact with that as much as we can as we go. If you've got specific questions around the content or any of the stuff we come up or you'd like us to cover, put that into the Q&A, which is separate to the chat. But that helps us to make sure if you've got a question that you'd like us to respond to, we can put it in there and go from there. So let's kick off around the conversation of differentiating leadership, and want to help you think about differentiating leadership in a few different ways. And the first is, and hopefully you've got some stuff that you can make notes on. This is makes much more, otherwise you're going to have to sort of do theatre of the mind stuff. But a lot of stuff that we want to start with is how we define and how we see leadership and how it's different to other parts of our roles. So if someone was to ask you to define leadership, how would you do that? What is your definition of leadership? Make a note. I'm going to share some definitions shortly, but it's worth noting that if you put, the last time I did this, I put leadership, definition into Google. I haven't done it into ChatGPT or anything like that, but I got over 1 billion hits in a second. So there's definitely no one specific definition of leadership that has been landed upon and agreed to. And in fact, one of the things that we'll often share in the program is that this quote from Ralph Stodgel, that there are almost as many definitions of leadership as there are people who have attempted to define it. So I'd imagine all of us are going to have different views on what leadership is. And I think for us to try and get one specific definition that we all agree on might not be the most useful thing. But as a leader, you being clear about what you mean by leadership can help you when you're working with your team, when you're working with your boss, when you're working with other stakeholders around what you think leadership is and therefore what you do in order to add value as a leader. So I'm not going to sort of give you an answer right now around that, but also talk about one of the patterns that we'll see when we do see definitions and people trying to define leadership. And that it's normally got some sort of combination of these three elements. It's talking about the leader or themselves, who they are. So you as the leader, if you're the new leader here, okay, so who am I? Like, what's my role here? What's my contribution? The team, so the people that you're working with, the people that you are, whose performance you are trying to support, you have some sort of responsibility and accountability for the team, and the organization, so who you're working on behalf of, what you're trying to do. And so most definitions of leadership in an organizational context, at least, and certainly would say that we see leadership in lots of different places around the world, not just in organizations. But in an organizational context, most of the times when we're talking about leadership, we're going to be balancing and factoring in these three things: the leader themselves, who they are, their goals, their values, their capabilities; the team, so the people that they are working with; and the organization that, who they're working for. And one of the challenges of leadership is that these three things are always changing and interacting with each other. Who you are as an individual is always changing. Your team are going to be at different stages of experience, of capacity, of skills and all that sort of thing. And the organization is going to be changing. The market might be changing. The strategy might be changing. Lots of different things changing. But it's a really helpful thing to keep in mind thinking about leadership, whatever your version and definition of leadership is, factoring in those three things. If your definition did not include one or more of those elements, maybe have a think about, okay, cool, so what is it that my definition is different to here? And is there any elements of the team, the organization, myself, that I want to bring into this? As I said, there's no rights and wrongs, but the clearer that we are on what we think that leadership is, the easier it is for us to decide the things that we do that add value as a leader and the things that we don't do and the things that we want to move away from and shift away from. And so when we're exploring this, as we go further into differentiating leadership, what we're going to be talking about as well is how leadership might be considered different to other elements in your role. And particularly for new leaders, one of the things that we know is that quite often you get into your leadership role because you're good at your craft. You're good at the thing that you did. You might have been a very good salesperson and then you become a sales leader. You might have been a very good engineer and then you become an engineering leader. And if you haven't made a shift in your mind that, okay, so this role as an engineering leader or a sales leader is different to my role as the technician, then we can have some challenges. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And we're also going to make a distinction between one of the other things that we'll quite often talk about is this definition between leadership versus management. And so just a quick yes, no, just drop into chat around, do you think that leadership is the same as management? Yes, no, just a Y and an YN. No, 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 no. It's not a trick question. No, 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 no. We haven't got any yeses yet. No, 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 no. Leadership is not the same. Yes, Sachin. Leadership is Avril. Yeah, a couple of people saying yeah. So most people saying no, leadership is not the same as management, and some people saying yes. So this is another example that I would point to around this idea that the way that you differentiate leadership is going to impact how you turn up as a leader, the actions that you take, and the subsequent sort of flow-on effects of that. And so I'm going to share some definitions that have come from a meta-analysis recently around leadership and management. And this is not to say that these are right, but to help you to consider, okay, does this become useful for me? If you said yes, that they are the same, then what that tends to imply is that you view leadership in the context of an organization through hierarchy and structure and sort of getting tasks done. And others will sort of say leadership and management are different for various different reasons, and they've got different ways that they define them. And so I'm just reading a comment from Sabina there that you can be a leader without being a manager. I would agree with that. There'd be a bunch of people that would disagree with that. And so an interesting thing for you to consider is how would you identify a leadership? I'm going to give you some reflective questions at the end of this session that you can go away and sort of keep in mind as you go and look to keep on differentiating leadership. And just observing leadership might be interesting and seeing, are the leaders that you see those who are managers only, or do you see leadership from people who are not managers as well? And so that's something to think about. Adam Grant is someone who is an organizational psychologist and professor out of Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania, I think it is. And he's one of my intellectual crushes. He's got some great thinking on leadership and performance at work. And one of the things that he says is that management might be the most undervalued part of leadership. And I think one of the risks that we run sometimes is that quite often we kind of leadership's the sexy bit and management's the boring bit. But there is some real value in both leadership and management. I think your ability to differentiate them, or even if you say they're the same thing, it's all one big same thing. Just knowing that they're both leadership and management add value, I think is a really important thing to do. And an example of this that I would say is that some people will talk about, setting the vision or being inspirational or building engagement as part of the things that leaders do. Good luck doing that if you haven't processed someone's leave request. Mm-hmm. That's not very sexy, it's not very exciting. But if you haven't done some of those things, like the management stuff, they are some of the things that really do allow you to do good leadership as well. And so while this is a leadership conversation and the programs that we run on leadership, it's certainly not to say that management is not a really important part of the role of a leader. Okay, so I'm going to share some definitions that have come from meta-analysis by Geertz in 2024 as a way of considering what are some of the ways that academics have looked to differentiate leadership and management. And this is, again, not to say it's correct, but it tends to be the definition here is fairly useful, and the sort of the ways that they've kind of pulled them apart. And one of the things I'll talk about a bit later as well is sometimes as a leader, we constantly, and when we're developing as a leader, we are constantly seeking to be right and the right answer and the right way to lead and the right thing to do. And I think that's a well-intended trap that we create for ourselves sometimes. And as I said, there's like 1 billion plus definitions of leadership. So it's almost impossible to find the right definition. And if we haven't got the right definition, how do we do the right thing as a leader? what I think is something we can all focus on as leaders, and what we encourage people to do, is to think about useful ways to lead. Is this a useful way to lead? And the intent here is to share some definitions that might be useful. They may not even be right, but they might be useful for you when you think about differentiating leadership and management. And so I didn't want to fill the screen with text. And so I'm just going to read these definitions. You don't need to get too hung up on them, but get a sense of them, and love to see if there's any questions or anything that emerges as a result of these definitions. So from GITS 2024, leadership is the process of leaders and team members collaborating meaningfully and responsibly to realize a shared purpose and vision. So the process of leaders and team members collaborating responsibly, shared purpose and vision, sort of very much a collaborative approach there. Management is the process of exercising authority to ensure others produce predictable, effective, and efficient results. And so if leadership is about collaborating to work towards a shared purpose and vision, and management is about using authority to have predictable, effective, and efficient results, I think that's a useful distinction and way to differentiate what leadership and management are from each other. And I think the thing that offers us is also, well, actually, there'll be times when management is more useful than leadership right now. And there'll be times when leadership is more useful than management. And so the idea of being able to choose what your approach is really helpful. And another help, if you've wrapped these up together, be interesting for you to think about how do I apply both of these things, which could be useful in different directions. Like an extreme example is, if we're in an emergency situation and we have to evacuate, I would love for someone to take some authority, be very directive, and us to all fall in line. I don't want us to sit around and have a conversation and collaborate and try and brainstorm what might be the next best thing. Like there are times when, and this, that's an extreme example, but when we're talking about it in the work context, it's quite often where there's higher risk. It might be safety risks, it might be financial risk, it might be reputational risk, where we choose to use that end of the approach where management might be more effective for what we're trying to achieve, and leadership might be when we're trying to achieve other things more collaboratively in different ways. Carrot versus stick, Mifon, maybe. Yeah. And so again, this is like what we hope is, sorry, I just moved out of focus there. What we hope is, it's not coming back. There we go. Is that you'll be able to make some of these distinctions yourself. And what that allows you to do is to choose how and when you turn up as you go. All right. So having sort of talked about differentiating leadership versus management, I want to talk about another distinction. And that involves a story, which is this guy who is basically a better looking, better golfing version of me. He's my golf coach, Bobby. And he was a very, very, very good golfer. He was a professional golfer. And so this is him in sort of professional golfer mode. He won tournaments, he played on multiple tours and all that sort of thing. But now he's a golf teacher. He coaches people, and that's what he does. And one of the things that he says to me is that he is a golf professional, not a professional golfer. And I talked to him about this. I said, what do you mean? Talk to me more about this. Talk to me more about this idea of being a golf professional, not a professional golfer. He said, well, when I was a professional golfer, I just looked after myself. I was almost selfish. My whole focus was, how can I improve myself? How do I get my game as good as it can be? How do I make my performance maximized? Last year, he did thousands and thousands of lessons. And so his goal as a golf professional was not to be better himself as a golfer, but to make as many other golfers better as he could. So individually, they didn't get as better. He put thousands of hours into his coaching. Each individual didn't get, 1,000 hours worth of better. But his contribution to, the improvement of his students was significant. If he'd put that effort into himself, his golf would have gone, back up to the levels where he's quite capable. He's quite comfortable that he's not going to be as good a golfer as he ever was, because this is now his role as a golf professional, not a professional golfer. And I was chatting to him and I thought there's some real parallels for what happens for leaders, and particularly new leaders, making the distinction between being a leading professional and being a professional leader. So taking your role as a leader sort of seriously and knowing that it's different to just being good at the thing that got you there. Marshall Goldsmith's got a book, and I've never read it. And I reckon it's one of the few books that you could almost not read and just listen to just hear the title, like, oh yeah, that feels useful. And the title of the book is What Got You Here Won't Get You There. So quite often what gets us into roles is the fact that we are a leading professional. But that doesn't get us to the point where we are professional leaders. And there's this difference. And I'm going to share some observations that I've had anecdotally around what might make a difference between being a leading professional versus a professional leader. But I'd love for you to make just a couple of quick notes now for yourself before I sort of lead the witness around this. What are some things that you think? And if you want to drop some comments in, please do that as well. But what are some of the things that you think differentiate a leading professional and a professional leader? And while you're doing that, I'll just sort of see if there's any comments that I can respond to. Gonzalo talks about two sides of the same coin, but persona change between the two. So your ability to switch between leadership and management, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but behavioral flexibility for a leader is a superpower. If you're able to adapt and respond your adaptation, that's your behavior, that's really, really useful. Technical skills versus people skills, Claudia, I agree with that. Keith, that is very, very common. So quite often the challenge, right? So if we think about, so what Keith has mentioned here, some of us need to continue being a leading professional while being a professional leader at the same time. I'd say most people along various, parts of their career are going to find this a lot. It's probably most acute when you move from being an individual contributor into a leadership role. That's that really acute where your operational load is still quite high, and then your strategic and leadership role is also high. It's particularly difficult if you're doing it within the same team that you were in. So if you go to become the leader of the team that you've been in, that's one of the biggest challenges. So people are used to seeing you do your work, and so your role doesn't get replaced. You just get this extra workload. Really, really common, really challenging. It would be easier to move into a new team in your organization where you hadn't had an existing role, and then you could kind of, sort of still know the organization, but, you've got a leadership role there, not an individual, individual contributor role. Easier again to go to a whole new organization, but then you lose a lot of the things that have given you that opportunity, but also you lose the experience, the connections, the relationships that are very helpful as a leader. So Keith, I think it was Keith, completely agree. And I think this speaks to one of the things I think that Gonzalo was also talking about, your ability to move between modes and shift between modes. We'll pick this up a bit later when we talk about a continuum of how leaders can approach their work. But that ability to shift and adapt, and knowing whether you have a preference for being a leading professional versus being a professional leader. Coaching conversation I had just this morning was around this sense of how do I quite enjoy being on the tools. I quite enjoy doing the stuff that I know how to do, that I've been good at for a number of years. That's okay. Just what does that mean that you are going to spend less time, put less energy and attention and time into? See if I can respond. It looks like there's been a couple of really interesting responses here. Yeah, Katrina, I'd agree with that. Yeah, I think Nanette, I'd agree with your sense as well there that, thinking about you and your craft versus how you sort of interact with your team in your organization, which I think comes back to that triangle that we shared earlier on as well. Is that it's almost like this different perspective that you take, and it's sort of where you focus your attention and your energy. is really, really interesting. So this is not to say what's right and wrong, but these are a few observations, personal observations that I've had around how we might differentiate. Sorry, my face is cutting off some of those. Some of the differences between how we might see a leading professional versus a professional leader. And so the first is that you get recognized for expertise as opposed for enabling others. You solve problems versus you're developing the capacity for others to solve problems. And that's probably a big one as a leader, because you feel like you're doing a lot there. Like people come to you with a problem and you solve it for them. It feels really good, really helpful. And the professional leaders will tend to develop the capacity for others to develop their problems using coaching, teaching, mentoring, various different ways they might do that. But that's one of the shifts. They're highly effective individually, leading professional, versus they are amplifiers of team effectiveness. A leading professional works in the system versus on the system, those kind of things. And there's probably a whole bunch. We could probably spend another, hour and a half picking this apart, and you could spend this forever. But if this is a useful way for you to think about differentiating leadership for you, and it's the reason I'm sharing it today is because it's one of the real challenges that people have around this. It can be a very helpful kind of way to distinguish this and keep this in mind for yourself and make some of your own decisions around that. All right. So we've talked about sort of in terms of when we're differentiating leadership, we're talking about sort of firstly defining it. We've talked about how it might be the same or different to management. We've talked about this differentiation between being a leading professional versus a professional leader. Also now I want to talk about different leadership models and different approaches to leadership. And this speaks a little bit to the idea that I was talking about before, where we want to be able to know the right way to lead. What is the right way to lead? And love for you to just drop into the chat how many sort of leadership models do you think that there are that might have had some sort of research behind them? There's some sort of peer based research evidence. 4, 6, too many. I think many people would agree with you, Caroline. Not many, Marcus. Lots, says Rebecca. 100 says 93038. Lots. 2, not very many. 1,000, hundreds. So my last look was this was a list of 150 that had some sort of research around it. This is not necessarily to say that they were all effective and they weren't all proven to be. Yes, we're in slightly more than 4. Not to say they're all proven to be effective and all that sort of thing. 160, very good guess, Blake. But this was the latest one. And I had to update this last time I looked at it. It had been at 135 or thereabouts, and it shifted up to 150. And that was the last time I looked. So there's probably more. But the point is that there's lots of different ways that people have conceptualized leadership. They've thought about it and they've done enough to put research into this and publish papers on this, or maybe multiple papers and books and all this sort of thing. And so there's a whole range of different pathways that you could choose to be a leader. And again, I'd go back to the encouragement that I'd have for you is to think about, okay, so what's useful? Like one of these 150 might be right. Probably not likely to be the right one for everyone in every context and in every situation. And so some research that Gartner did recently, well, about 5 years ago now, in Gartner, a global consultancy, they sort of compared 7 of the more popular ones. And so those were situational leadership. Some of you may have heard of these types of leadership. So situational leadership, adaptive leadership, authentic leadership, transformational, servant, digital, and agile leadership. And it was a pretty even spread among the people. They went to about 3,000 people and they sort of said, okay, well, which approach do you apply or try to apply as a leader? And they gave them these 7, these were the ones that came through. It was roughly, 1 in 7 split. Some might be slightly less, some might be slightly more. And then what they did, they sort of said, okay, well, let's measure team effectiveness based on each of these different approaches. And what you see here is that generally what happened is that the team effectiveness was not really impacted by the leadership approach. But what was impacted by leadership approach is how well each of those was done. So how well each of those approaches to leadership was done. So the top quartile of each type tended to be better, was better than the bottom quartile in any. It's better than the median in any. So that can kind of be liberating as a leader in terms of, like, rather than trying to get the right strategy for leadership, it's almost like picking a way that you think is going to be relevant and useful for your context. And I think one of the things that will mediate this is that we'll tend to find, for example, agile leadership is more prevalent in tech industries. And so it's probably applied in a context that's more useful for that. So that might be something that people choose to do. So there's some confounding factors in there, but the principle holds that if you choose an approach that you think is going to be aligning those three things we talked about, you, who you are, how you see the world, your goals, values, capabilities, your team, and what your organization is trying to achieve, you choose an approach to leadership that factors those things in, and then you do it well, it's really likely to lead to better outcomes if you do it consistently. And so some research that came from Dunst and others, let me share this with you, basically said that depending on, like, they were trying to, again, this was another meta-analysis of all different approaches to leadership. It's like, the more frequently you did those leadership practices, the more positive outcomes there were. And so I just got some of the stuff that they used for their research. They looked at 112 studies. There was 39,000 participants from 31 countries, including Australia and New Zealand. I think we disproportionately made up about 10% of the studies and participants in that. And the basic conclusion was that no one approach to leadership and no one style was better than others, but it was context driven. It was driven by context. So we've spoken about the context of you as the leader, who you are, the context of your team, the context of the organization. They also spoke about the context of the culture in which the leadership was existing. So the sort of national culture or the religious culture, also the hierarchical nature of the organization, as well as the organization type. So public, private, startup, all those sorts of things. So context makes a big difference to this, but across all of that, the thing that cut through was, how often are you leading? You know, how often are you doing those things that feel like leadership, that you think are leadership? Doesn't matter your approach, but those things that align to leadership are the things that lead to more positive outcomes. And I think as a leader, in particular as a new leader, it can be really overwhelming to think about, like, what are all my options here? What are all the different ways that I can lead? And to think that you don't have to pick the right one, but if you pick a useful one that you have considered, look, this is what does, and then you put those into practice regularly, you're likely to lead to more positive outcomes. Another way I want you to just think about, and I want to share with you around thinking about leadership frameworks, and this will kind of tie into the leadership versus management conversation we had a little bit earlier as well, is a bit of an old school framework. It's called the Tenenbaum-Schmidt continuum. And I don't expect many people have heard of it before. And part of me likes to say it because I like to say it. I like to say Tenenbaum-Schmidt. But the Tenenbaum-Schmidt continuum, it's about 70 years old, about 1955 or thereabouts. And one of the things that tips me off to say, oh, this was a little bit like, this is not the most modern of frameworks, is that it talks about subordinates. We tend to not talk about subordinates very much anymore in our when we're working with leaders and teams. But that kind of tips you off. But I still think that the concept is useful for us to have a chat about. And so the framework says at two ends of the spectrum, you could lead or you could manage, you could be a manager, you could lead using authority, like just using pure authority. That's all that you would do. Or you could, at the other end, give freedom. You just sort of give freedom and you let your team you take a laissez-faire approach to leadership and your team does what your team does. So is it manager-centered or is it team member-centered? It's this kind of spectrum. And along the way, it sort of says, there's these kind of gradients where there's a mix of like, okay, so I'm more authority, but a little bit of freedom. or I'm a lot more authority, but a lot more freedom and a little bit of authority. And there's that kind of mix and balance as you go up and along. And the reason I think that this is a useful framework is it kind of distills a lot of the ways to think about what we're talking about already, and the kind of decisions that leaders need to make regularly in a situation. And I'm going to ask you, with all of this, and don't get too caught up on the little bits along the bottom. They kind of got little stages. There's tell, sell, suggest, consults. I'd like you to think about this at kind of a macro level. Do I tend to use authority, or do I tend to use to give freedom? Like, or what, when I'm asking you these 4 questions. And these 4 questions, I think, are really helpful for you to know and to then make some decisions about how you want to lead. So the first question is, where are you spending most of your time as a leader at the moment? So if someone would have, been watching you for the last week or the last month or so, where would you assess that you are spending most of your time, most of your actions are falling? Are they sort of falling right up towards the freedom end? Are they falling right at the authority end, or are they sort of at some point in between? So this is not where you want to be, but where are you actually operating, right? So like, not sort of like, yeah, like a lot of the time in between. Yeah. Cool. So people are sort of tending to sit somewhere in between. Second question is, where would you like to spend most of your time? So the first thing is, where are you spending your time? Your energy, your attention. And the second question is, where would you like to? And so what this helps you to differentiate is, what's my current reality and what's my aspiration of this, of my, how I want to turn up as a leader. And what this can sometimes, like, there's kind of 3 things that could happen here, right? Well, like, you're either going to be like, bang, here's where I'm spending my time. Here's where I'd like to be. I'm in the right spot. And if that's the case, you want to go, okay, how did that happen? And how do I make sure that continues to happen? And those things stay in alignment. One might be that you are spending your time here, but you'd like to give more freedom. Okay. That's a good bit of diagnosis. Okay, cool. One might be that you want to use more authority. So those are things that happen. So for me personally, my personal preference is going to be that I'm way up towards the freedom end. Like, I don't want structure. I don't want to like that's way up there. So actually, no, that's not the most useful place for me to function. Like, I need to actually deliberately add more structure and guidance and authority into my approach because of my strong preference for freedom. The third question is, what would your team or your boss say? So what would an important stakeholder say about where they would like you to spend most of their time, your time? So again, if we use me as an example here, like, I want to spend my time, just giving freedom. I'd actually probably like to, so that my preference would be to give a lot of freedom. I'm probably spending my time almost towards that end, but my stakeholders might say, actually, want you to be giving us a lot more structure, giving us a lot more authority, and using that a little bit more. So there might be 3 different points now. It's like, here's where I am, here's where I'd like to be, and here's where others would like me to be. And so we're managing these tensions, and these tensions are constantly existing in leadership. There's these kind of different elements. So we're basically talking about you, your team, your organization, sort of managing those tensions a different way they're pulling. And the fourth question is, what are the trade-offs that each of those decisions require? So as you add more authority into your approach, what does that mean? What does that mean you're trading off? As you're adding more freedom, what are the things that you are trading off? And so at a very high and generic level, and sort of, I'd say when we use more authority, one of the things we are then trading off is we are potentially trading off relationships, and we're potentially trading off levels of engagement and discretionary effort. We're maybe less likely because people get in the habit, and it doesn't have to be sort of, I don't know another way to say this. It's not going to come out nice, but like nasty authority. It might just be like, I'm really clear. This is what we're doing. This is how we're going to do it. There's like, I'm going to have very exact standards, and I'm going to use that authority. And then if it's not met, I'm going to just sort of use the structures that we've got in place at our organization to manage your performance. What that might end up being is people might do really high, have a really like meet their expected outputs, but not exceed it. They may not go beyond that because they think that their whole role is to meet your expectations and to meet what has been given to them. So I'm trading off some stuff there. The other end, if I give freedom completely, one of the things I'm trading off is control. Like I have less control over how you might do that task. If I say, hey, look, I'd like us to have a report delivered by next Wednesday, go and do it however you see fit. I give up some of the control there. I don't give as much guidance about the milestones along the way, the progress that we've made, the format of the stuff, and then there's less quality control. And so that's one of the things I'm trading off. There's loads of different ones in there, but these are decisions we're making all of the time. Every decision has the needs trade-offs and has the potential for unintended consequences. And so just thinking about this, it's like, yeah, what are the trade-offs that you have? It might be your time and energy and attention. It might be as you use more authority, that's kind of a bit more energy intensive for you. So you've got to be on it a bit more. As you sort of get a bit more time, and you don't have to be as close to the tasks, and you give more freedom. One of the things you have less there is less visibility. You're trading off visibility. You don't know. You haven't got your finger on the pulse there. And so one of the things that almost always, and we spend in the program that we run, we spend a while sort of having these conversations and exploring this for people. But almost always the conclusion is that the answer is not being in a spot. The ability that you want to be able to develop as a leader is understanding what is required of you in that moment. And so your ability as a leader to add range, your ability to move up and down the Tenenbaum-Schmidt continuum is one of the things that is fantastic. To when you need to, when it's helpful, use authority. When it's helpful, when it serves the team, the organization to give freedom, that ability to have that behavioral range is really helpful. And that's something you can do. But it is also important that you choose well. So not just that you can move up and down, but you choose the right thing at the right time. I spoke earlier about being a passionate but not particularly great golfer. One of the things that as you get better as a golfer, not only can you get better at using each of the 14 clubs that you're allowed to carry in your bag. So there's kind of, okay, these are my options. They might be, the ways that I might approach my leadership. But you also get better at choosing the right club for the right time, the right thing that you need to do. You use that, not because you like to use a particular club or you don't avoid using other clubs because you don't like them. This is what the situation requires, and you use that. And in the context of this, one of the things that leaders who develop and as they sort of grow as leaders, they get better at going, well, it's not necessarily my preference, but this is what the situation requires, and I'm going to use more authority, or I'm going to give more freedom, whatever that is, moving up and down based on that. And so as a leader, you want to be building your range, and you want to be building your skill at choosing your approach for each of the contexts that you're faced by. We've got a question that's come through. I might pause just now before we get into the next and final way that we're going to look at differentiating leadership. How do we manage what our reporting manager organization is expecting of us versus what our staff want, especially expectation on opposite ends of the leadership continuum? That is a great question to keep in mind. And my answer is almost always going to be conversations and be explicit. So speak to your leader about what their expectations are around that. Speak to your team about what their expectations are around that. And then you can sort of make some decisions about what you need to do. And you can be explicit and sort of say, you don't always, I think one of the ways to set yourself up to be exhausted as a leader is to try and give everyone what they want all the time. Like if you wanted to really exhaust yourself, you would try and please your boss and your team all the time, even when they're asking for different things. And so it's not that I wouldn't say that's not the great thing to do, but have those conversations and understand there's nuance and complexity in this, and understand what's behind your manager or organization's requirements, understands what's behind your team's desires and needs, and see what is the stuff that you can come up with that works for them. So, for example, it might be we need reporting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It needs to be in this format and in this way. And if you understand, well, that helps the business get visibility on that, then you can frame that context for your teams. Like, look, this isn't what we love, but when we do this, it gives the organization the visibility that they need for them to make decisions, and it allows us to be positioned as doing strategic work. And so they know that we're doing the right work. I know we don't love it, but that's what we can do. And so it's, again, I'd say trade-offs, but making deliberate decisions around that. Not an easy one, and I think one that you're not going to get right all of the time. And it's going to be keep on moving, sort of depending on the context. Is there anything you'd add to that, Danny?
No, I think I couldn't agree more. And I think it's really that piece around continuously being curious and trying to understand where each of these questions or these pieces are coming from, and being really clear around where are we headed. Because I think that's what people are looking for. So no, 100% agree. It's that curiosity piece.
Yeah, great.
There was one other question, King, to throw in there that came in. It's not in the question section. Okay. It was earlier on in the comments from Mitchell, and it was, if I sort of summarise it, it's basically, how do you change people's perceptions of you, and what changes can you make to become a leader? And I think, I throw that back to you in terms of how important feedback is.
Oh yeah, it's really useful to, like, it's one of the things I was going to be talking about, just to wrap things up around. People form their perceptions of you over time, and I often think about, like, what does a brand do? And I don't necessarily love personal brand and all that sort of thing, but if we're thinking about, like, what does Coca-Cola, McDonald's, whatever do, like, they're really consistent at putting messages out in a way that, like, that they want, and we have our own perception of any brand, but that perception is formed on the back of, like, our accumulated experiences with them. And so if there's a particular experience, like a particular way that you want your team to think about you, you can't really force them to think about you in a certain way, but you can make it more likely by turning up in that way really consistently. That's one of the things that you can do to sort of manage their perception. But also, say, similar to what I was saying to the previous one, having conversations and helping people understand what you're trying to achieve and what you're working with. I think one of the best things, my daughter has just gone into year 8 this year, like today's her first day of school for the year, and talking about high school maths, and, like, I think about, my high school maths, and we always used to get partial marks for showing our work. Like, the answer was one thing, but we got partial marks. Even if we got the answer wrong, we get partial marks for showing our working. And I think as a leader, like, you showing your working gives you partial marks. You don't have to give what your team wants all the time. It's like, hey, this is why I made this decision. This is what I'm working on. This is what I'm working towards. And people go, okay, well, I can see what you're doing, Mitchell. I can see what you're working towards. And then they can sort of they can help you, and they can give you feedback on that. Hey, you know how you said you were going to try and be more, encourage more innovation. One thing I noticed was X, Y, Z, and you can get that feedback from them, and then if you take that feedback on and you demonstrate that you're trying to do more work with that, then people love it. People don't expect you to be perfect. They want you to be working on it. They want you to be trying to get better. And I think the good thing about that does is it also role models what a lot of leaders want from their team as well. I don't want you to be perfect. I want you to be having a crack. I want you to be trying. And so when in doubt, role model what you think might be useful for your team to demonstrate. And so probably what you'd want from them is that sort of thing, where you can sort of say, hey, look, this is what I'm working on. And there's no guarantee, but they can definitely support you. And I think that sort of backs up Danny's point around feedback and inviting feedback and getting feedback in.
Feedback, I always say feedback is a gift. Sometimes it's a gift that you might not necessarily want. However, vulnerability is the key. And I think you'll never know it all. You will always make mistakes. You will always need help. And I think if you put that out to your team, then you're going to close those gaps, most
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think Danny and I have spoken about this before as well. As like you role modeling, this thing. Like I've never ever seen someone yell at someone to relax and have it work. Like when someone's really worked up, I used to do this a lot, especially when my daughter was younger. I was like, relax, calm down. And it was like, it doesn't work. And like even though as much as we want it to, your best chance is to role model what you want from others. And so if you are role modeling that you're working on, improving yourself, that you are being vulnerable and saying that there are areas that you want to improve, it just makes it more likely that your team will do the same. Like look, I want you to bring your challenges to me. I want you to bring your problems to me early. I want to know what you're struggling with, but I'm not going to show you any of that myself. Like it just makes it a really almost incongruous. And so that, people are looking at their leaders and getting those signals. And so if you're able to send those signals strongly, that's a really helpful way to do that as well. So yeah, thanks, Danny. I agree with that as well. The last part of differentiating leadership. So it's like kind of a bit of a whirlwind around different ways to differentiate leadership. What is leadership? How is it different from management? Professional leader versus leading professional. Talking about different approaches to leadership in different leadership frameworks. And the final way is probably like to talk about is probably what you'd really like to know. How do you differentiate your leadership, your approach to leadership? And this is kind of a little bit like what you were talking about, Mitchell. I think it was you that was talking about this. How do you manage the perceptions of others? And I've got a couple of different suggestions, and I think one of them, I'm just going to skip up a slide, talks about this idea of getting feedback. And really, really quickly, one of my favorite frameworks ever is the Johari window, which I won't talk you through it now, but Johari, just look it up, Johari window, talks about, like you'll find a 2 or 3 minute YouTube clip on it, talks about the fact that getting feedback from others can help us be brought around, like get information from our blind spots, the stuff that we don't fully understand, and constantly getting feedback is really helpful. And then it's amazing how often you receiving feedback and asking for it leads to your team members doing the same thing. So that's kind of one of the things. As you're differentiating your own leadership, learn more and more about yourself, learn more about the areas you want to develop. And that's one of the ways that you can differentiate your leadership and make it more aligned, those 3 things. So quite often when people move into leadership, they do what their team wants or what their organization wants and not what they want. And that ends up not being sustainable. Or they go too hard on what they want and not what their team wants and what their organization wants, and that's not sustainable. And so just keeping on getting that feedback so you can keep those 3 things in balance is a really useful thing to do. So that would be one. Another bit of advice that I've got for you is using a diagram, not a map. So on the left-hand side is one of the original maps of the London Underground, which was technically accurate. It had landmarks, it had all those sort of things, but people didn't use it. It was just almost too detailed. They couldn't utilize it. On the right-hand side, an electrical engineer came in and said, actually, what we need is a network diagram, not a map. And so the right-hand image is less accurate, but more useful. And so I think when you're this is kind of something I've already said, when you're looking to differentiate your leadership, don't try and get too caught up in being technically correct. You need enough truth in what you're doing. I'd certainly say you've seen what we talked about today. Reference, reliable sources of evidence that suggests what's going to be helpful here and what's not going to be helpful here. But then apply those in your context and make it more useful. Don't worry about being right. Think about being useful. And I think, the diagram, the tube diagram there, like they're all evenly spaced. They only run at 3 different angles. None of that's actually true, but it's an easier way for people to get around and navigate from them. And so your ability to do that for yourself and for others is a really useful skill. And then there are 4 questions, that are prompts that I think that you can use and can apply continuously. You could do 1 a day, you could do all 4 once a week, you could use these in any sort of type of sequence that you like. But these are 4 questions that I think that you can ask to help you differentiate leadership. What leadership have you observed? And this goes back to your definition, like, when did you see leadership? What does it look like? Is it only from managers? Are people who are managers not even leading? Like, what is the leadership you observed? What is the leadership that you demonstrated? What leadership did you demonstrate? So in a situation, maybe you're in a more senior team where you're not actually the formal leader of that team. In what ways did you lead in that meeting? In what ways? It might have been asking a question, it might have been listening, it might have been a whole range of different ways. And these can help you to, again, get clear and differentiate leadership for your own context. How did that leadership emerge and come forward from either yourself or from others? How does that come about? Because is it only from authority? Is it only from positions of power? Then that's something to keep in mind. Or are there other ways that can happen? And then the 4th one is, okay, so what does this mean for me in my leadership? So there are 4 questions that you can ask yourself on any sequence, any time that you like. What's the leadership you observed? What's the leadership you demonstrated? How did that emerge? And what do I want to do with this? We are coming towards the end, but I wanted to share one reflection from Gabrielle, who was a participant in October 2024. And I think it kind of really nicely summed it up, her perspective around leadership having gone through the program. And I think that one of the things is that, like, we're never done with leadership. We never win leadership. We only play. We just kind of keep on turning up and doing it. And one of the senses of freedom that can come from the fact that there is no one right way to lead is that there's not one prescribed way, but you can find a way to lead that works for you, your team, and your organization by putting effort and making that happen as regularly as you can. You're going to get more and more positive outcomes. So leave you with that thought. Thanks, Danny.
Okay. Thanks so much, Keegan. Thank you, everyone, for jumping on today. I love a masterclass, and I also find them quite frustrating because there's so much more that we want to do. And I think there's so much food for thought based on all of your contributions today. If you enjoyed today, we would love to see you in the room. Keegan and I are working together in March on the next upcoming program, where 5 days of reflection, activity, fun, challenge, models, application, etc. So come on board. We've got a few spots left. That closing for enrolments for that will be on the 9th of February. And if you're interested in the second half of the year, we've got a second program running, which I can't see past your head.
Oh, sorry. That's the 3rd to the 7th of August.
3rd to 7th of August, thank you, with enrolments closing there. To make life easier, just snap the QR code and that'll take you through to the website and give you a little bit more information. And just to let you know, we do run these quite regularly, masterclasses across all of our different areas of leadership. So just snap the QR code, go in and have a look at what's out there. But again, thank you so much. And thank you, Keegan. I think that's just been a really great overview and intro to what is an ongoing and yet doable piece around leadership. So thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, everyone.